The Atlanta Braves lost the opener to the Mets after a bad call from the umpires and some poor pitching from Bryce Elder. Let's talk about it. Yes, welcome on into Braves Today, a production of the Belief Podcast Network and presented to you by FanDuel. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby, author of the Braves Today newsletter over at bravestoday.com. In just a few minutes, I want to talk about the injury status of the rest of Atlanta's rotation, the guys who are injured, who cleaned out their lockers but are going to start throwing, apparently, this week, and what manager Walt Weiss said about their availability this year. But before we do that, Braves dropped the opener to the New York Mets 8-5 in very frustrating fashion. If you did not have an opportunity to watch the game, long story short, the leadoff hitter hit what was called a ground rule double, and the ball goes under the padding at the base of the wall, kind of rattles around under the padding. And so Ronald Acuna Jr. does what you're supposed to do when he kind of throws his hands up and he signals, hey, the ball's under the padding. And the runner's awarded second base on a ground rule double. And New York challenges the judgment call that the ball was stuck under the padding. And on replay, they look and they say, the ball wasn't stuck. It was still a good little ways under the padding. And Ronald would have had to get down on like his hands and knees to pull it out of the padding. But they say the ball wasn't stuck. The ruling is overturned. We're going to award the runner second base. It was like a 10-minute delay for nothing. Literally did not change the outcome of the play. The runner didn't get any extra bases or anything. Waste of our time. And that was a symbol of how weird this first inning was going to get. That runner came around to score thanks to a Bo Bichette single. And Bo tried to steal second base on a 3-2 count. He was thrown out by Sean Murphy, but the pitch was ruled a ball, despite being almost entirely in the strike zone. Sean Murphy, who was trying to throw the runner out, did not challenge the incorrect call. Bryce Elder, who threw the pitch, did challenge the call and was not granted a challenge. Now, he wasn't incredibly insistent about it, right? He didn't start repeatedly mashing his head a bunch and yelling. But he taps his head and he points at the plate, and he doesn't get the call. He doesn't get the replay that would have overturned that to an inning double play. It had been one run scored on like 14 pitches. And what happens in that inning is there's another single, there's a strikeout, and then with the bases loaded, Bryce Elder hangs a slider to Brett Baty, and he hits a grand slam. And so at the end of the frame, you went from a 14-pitch, one-run inning to a 34-pitch, five-run inning, plus the warm-up tosses that Elder was doing to stay hot during the replay review on the very first at-bat. And the Braves just never recovered. They could never get out of that deficit. Elder was able to finish 5 innings. He allowed only 2 more runs the entire rest of the 5 innings. But it was too much of a hole, and they couldn't get out of it. I'm personally choosing to think of those 4 runs like they were unearned, right? The same that I would think of were an error to erase the third out of the inning and extend the inning. And not everybody's going to do that, and that's fine. And Bryce Elder still has to execute that slider to Brett Baty. But to me, this was a scenario where a mistake somewhat outside of Atlanta's control. Both Elder and Walt Weiss said after the game that Elder could have been more emphatic at challenging that pitch. The crew chief said after the game that none of the umpires saw the challenge. They were all focused on the play at second base. Crew Chief Andy Fletcher said that, again, that the umpires just didn't see it. They were all watching second base or watching for batter's interference on Murphy. And Walt Weiss acknowledged that reality. Quote, "It was an action play, so there's a lot going on. You're watching the throw down to second to see if he was going to be out. There was just a lot of moving parts." And Sean Murphy also took blame and said that he's got to be better about calling for the challenge himself in that situation. Quote, "I feel bad for Bryce because that's my responsibility and I didn't challenge it." Quote, "I didn't see Bryce signaling in the moment, but I should have challenged." So I think a couple things are all true here. One, bad calls are going to happen at times. And while I wish the ABS system was geared more towards we want to fix egregious mistakes and make sure they're always right, and I don't know what that would look like. Would that be some sort of system where all balls and strikes are called electronically? Would that be some sort of system where there's the ability for someone, whether it's a replay room or whatever, to buzz in to challenge a pitch that is a clear and obvious egregious issue, right? Does somebody from the league, the official scorer or whoever, have the ability to press a button and just call down, like in the NFL, how they can call down and say, hey, we're going to look at that to make sure we get it right? There's a lot of different things you can take from the ABS side of this and the umpire side of this. There's a lot of things you can take from the pitching side of this, right? Bryce Elder has to be better. And to his credit, he acknowledged that. He said, quote, "Got to make better pitches." He acknowledged that the whole scenario did not go the way they wanted, but at the end of the day, they've just got to execute. Quote, "I think if I would have really stood my ground and tapped my hat longer, then maybe he would have seen me. But I didn't, so we got to make better pitches." But at the end of the day, you lost the game. And frustratingly, the Braves have been one of the best teams in baseball this season. They are 67-41 against teams that are not the New York Mets. That translates to a 100 win pace. They've taken a series against the Brewers, beating Jacob Mrozarowski to do it. They took a series against the Dodgers, beating both Blake Snell and Justin Wrobleski, who was an all-star this year. They took multiple series against the Phillies, beating Christopher Sanchez. But against the New York Mets, they're 4-7. This is the first time the Mets have won the season series since 2017. And it's frustrating. It feels every year there's some bad team that Atlanta just can't seem to handle. And you could argue maybe a little bit that the Braves sometimes play down, or they play to the level of their opponents. Against teams with winning records, Atlanta's 31-19. They're legitimately one of, if not the best teams in baseball against good opponents. But they've also struggled with some bad teams this year. And at the end of the day, that's baseball. They're 1-4 against the San Francisco Giants. They're 2-4 against the Cardinals. Both those teams sold at the deadline. They're 1-2 against the Seattle Mariners. There's just... It's frustrating, but that's this dumb game that we watch every single day and obsess over and get mad about. That's baseball. In just a minute, let's talk about the news that Spencer Strider and Hurston Waldrep are starting throwing programs. They cleaned out their lockers, and now they're starting throwing programs. And what Walt Weiss said about it. Because, yes, it is a good thing that they are doing a throwing program versus having surgery, but I still don't think you see them in 2026. We'll talk about that next, right here on Braves Today. The official quote from Walt Weiss is, "I don't think you can count on them." Spencer Strider, Hurston Waldrep will start a throwing program this week. They were recently cleared to do that. Which is funny because I talked all day. I talked the first segment of the show yesterday about how they were not, about how Waldrep had cleaned out his locker, and I made a guess that meant we weren't going to see him the rest of the year. And it does make me feel better that Mark Bowman made the exact same guess with Spencer Strider that I made with Hurston Waldrep. That cleaning out the locker meant that they were done and they were probably bound for surgery. But they are starting throwing programs this week. In all likelihood, given the timing, we are already the second week of August, you don't see those guys this year. Maybe you're holding out hope that you can get something, relief appearances out of them in October. But you're at the point where it just doesn't feel like you have the time to get them back. And I think Spencer Schwellenbach is a good example of how you may not be able to get them back. Schwellenbach began a throwing program in June. He still is waiting for clearance to face live hitters. And some of the reports we've gotten is that his velocity is not fully back. He's not throwing the full arsenal, which typically means guys aren't ripping breaking balls and splitters. They're usually throwing a lot of fastball cutter, sinker stuff versus doing the high spin pitches, right? And even if he's magically cleared this week to go to Northport to start facing live hitters, he would have to do a couple live BPs before he began a rehab assignment. So Spencer Schwellenbach is ahead of those guys. And even he is not necessarily in a position to come back this year. If Schwellenbach were to get cleared this week, his rehab appearance would probably need to be the maximum 30 days. And so you're already midway through September. The goal for Spencer Schwellenbach, if he were cleared this week, would to get him a major league appearance the final week of the season. That would be the goal. It would be, can you get him an at-bat, get him some innings the last week so that he's faced hitters before you get to the postseason and you have information as to whether or not he can be on the roster. And Walt Weiss acknowledged that same point, talking about both of these guys, about how it is undeniably a good thing that they are starting to throw, but it means more for 27, not 26. Quote, it's great they're even talking about it at this point because I'm sure most of us had probably written that off. The fact that it's even a conversation, I think, is a positive thing. And on Strider specifically, he said, I think there was a possibility he could have been out for the year. That's why it's tough to put timelines out there because things change. The progression changes from day to day. It's never linear, but he's feeling good and the tests are positive. And the way that I'm viewing this is similar to how I'm viewing Chris Sale in 24 and Schwellenbach in 25. In both of those seasons, those guys hung around Atlanta and were throwing in Truist Park after Atlanta's season was over. I remember Atlanta got eliminated in the wild card round on Wednesday in San Diego in 24. And we were talking to Alex Anthopoulos on Friday. This is the infamous press conference where he said that Travis d'Arnaud's option was going to get picked up and there were no coaching changes coming. And then after they actually sat down and looked at everything, they changed their mind. But he told us during that press conference that he could look out his window and Chris Sale was on the mound at Truist Park throwing at that exact moment. Because Chris Sale wanted to make sure that he was healthy so that he could go into the offseason. There is a difference for a major league pitcher in going into an offseason focused on getting better, building strength, and improving yourself as a pitcher, and going into the offseason rehabbing an injury and with that lingering doubt of if you can still do it or not, if you're healthy or not. I've heard so many pitchers talk about this, about they push to get back, if nothing else, so that their offseason can be somewhat of a normal offseason. And instead of rehabbing, you're focused on getting better for the next year. And Schwellenbach in 25, he was starting to throw, or I think he was trying to throw. I'm sorry, no, it was Grant Holmes. I said Schwellenbach. It was Grant Holmes. Grant Holmes was throwing, trying to prove that he was okay and get back, just so that he could go into the offseason knowing that everything was okay. And I think you saw in 25, you saw the benefits of Sale doing that. In 26, you saw the benefits, of Grant Holmes doing that. Being confident in the fact that the stuff still worked, they were healthy, and that the test that came back, Waldrep got multiple opinions on the arm. Weiss said that the recent evaluation gave him the clearance to begin throwing. So clearly there's not structural damage to the ligament that requires surgical repair, right? It was legitimately probably just some sort of inflammation. And having that peace of mind is a big deal for them. But at the same time, you can't count on those guys. You can't count on Schwellenbach at this point. Do I think it's possible Schwellenbach is back in time to maybe give you a couple innings as a reliever in October? Maybe. I'm not going to bank on it. The only one of those guys that I'm going to bank on being available to take some innings is A.J. Smith-Shawver. And even then, I don't know what that's going to look like. He's nearing that point where they should be ready to call him back up and stick him into the Atlanta rotation if they want to, if they feel like they have a spot. The Braves rotation outside of last night has been very good since the All-Star break. So they may not feel like they have a spot for him right now. But, and so now we're in a scenario where I was mentally writing off Strider and Waldrep from next season's rotation. I was just assuming you wouldn't have those guys because it looked like they were bound for some sort of surgery. And they're not. And so now you can see how there are a ton of rotation options for the Braves next year. And let's go through some of these real quick, right? Because I feel like if these four are healthy, these guys are practically locks to be in the rotation to open the year. Chris Sale, duh. Spencer Schwellenbach, duh. A.J. Smith-Shawver, and Spencer Strider. Strider's a lock to be in the rotation if he's healthy because of money. A.J. and what he's been able to do when he's healthy. A.J. Smith-Shawver is, to me, a lock to be in the rotation because of his ceiling and his potential and what he can be. I think we saw last year that when he's on, he is really good. Remember that start in Cincinnati? It was home versus Cincinnati. 8 innings of scoreless one-hit ball, 5 strikeouts, 4 walks on 99 pitches. He had outings where he struck out 6 and 7 guys. He had outings where he went 8 scoreless. Like, A.J. Smith-Shawver, before he started to have some of the injury stuff pop up that ended up with him having Tommy John, had a 2.33 ERA in his first 7 starts. And the expected ERA in the FIP was a little bit higher, but not by a ton. He struck out 40 in 38 and 2/3 innings. So I've got him in that group if he's healthy and back to normal with the improved velocity he has after TJ. I've got him in that group. And then the battle for the final rotation spot would then come down to Bryce Elder, who's out of options, Ronaldo Lopez, who's out of options but has bullpen experience, Grant Holmes, same situation, Joey Wentz, same situation. Didier Fuentes is optionable and has bullpen experience, but I think if he stretches out over the winter and is coming into camp to be a starter, he's going to be the SP5. He's going to be the guy. Hurston Waldrep, if he gets a 4th option year, J.R. Ritchie, Owen Murphy, you've got a ton of options. And maybe they go out, maybe this is the offseason, they finally go out and sign somebody or trade for somebody. And so you add a veteran in there like a Sonny Gray or whatever, and now Atlanta can, maybe they decide to start AJ in the minors. Maybe they leave Didier in the bullpen, whatever. But not losing Strider and Waldrep for next year gives you a ton of options. And it kind of puts you in the same position you were in. We're adding a back-end starter. You've got a bunch of back-end starters at home. Do I think they probably should still add a veteran who can stack innings and can be that guy every fifth day? Yeah, they probably should. But you could also see their reasoning for not doing that. And I don't know. I assume you don't get anything from Waldrep and Strider this year. I assume you probably don't get anything from Schwellenbach this year. But having them for 27 is a big deal, because if they're healthy, and that's the major if, and even if you lose one of them to injury next year, you still have more frontline options than you had this season. I still think you got to go out and get a guy this winter. And as we get closer, probably after the postseason, we'll talk about free agency and what's out there and what the Braves need. And can you get a deal done before the lockout starts? Because the owners are going to lock out the players on December 1st. It's going to happen. There is nothing that will happen between now and December 1st to prevent a lockout from coming. The question is not, do you get locked out? The question is, do you miss games? The lockout is coming. It is a negotiating tactic by the league to pressure the players by not letting them in the facility, not letting them meet with the teams, not do anything like that, to try to give them a taste of what their life would be like without baseball. So that'll do it for a short episode of Braves Today for Tuesday, August 11th. Please like the video. Please subscribe both here and at bravestoday.com. Again, thought I had a really good piece yesterday about Dylan Dodd. To go check that out and just think about other possible bullpen guys for October. I do want to write one about some of the prospects, a Roldy Munoz, a Blake Burkhalter, and how if you call them up and give them an opportunity to get their feet wet in the majors, they could potentially help you in October as well. So that's coming probably a little bit later this week. And until next time, this has been Braves Today.